of affordable housing. Mr. Gary serves on the board of Encore Electric Delivery Company, LLC, the largest regulated electricity transmission and distribution service provider in the state of Texas, serving over 10 million customers. He also serves on the board of Preservation of Affordable Housing, Inc., a Boston-based nonprofit corporation that preserves, creates, and sustains affordable housing for lower-income populations across the nation. He previously served as an investment committee chairman of the National Equity Fund, Inc., the leading national syndicator of low-income housing tax credits, providing equity funding for the revitalization of communities and to create economic opportunities nationwide. Mr. Gary is a graduate and distinguished alumnus of Carleton College in Minnesota. He also holds an MBA in finance from the Graduate School of Business at Harvard University as well. He served on a number of state governing boards, including North Texas Tollway Authority and the Texas State Tax Reform Commission and the University of Texas System Board of Regents. Welcome to each one of our panelists. We're grateful that you're willing to be here to join us for our conversation today. So we're going to start off with a few softball questions for each of the panelists. Just to get the ball rolling, would each of you describe briefly for our audience how you became engaged in the work of affordable housing and your current role in helping close the gap between the need for affordable homes and available affordable units? So let's start out with Mr. Gary.
Well, in terms of getting involved in affordable housing, in the broader sense, I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, of all places. A lot of focus on that city these days. And I used to follow my uncle around. He was a small-time contractor, and I'd hand him tools and that sort of thing. And my father as well was a pretty adept at using tools and pretty much built in a rehab mode our first house. But my background's in finance. And when I came to Texas, my first assignment was with the single family home building company, Fox and Jacobs Syntex. And I started out in line with my background in finance as treasurer and did the mortgages and that sort of thing. But ultimately, I moved to the side of operations and handled the sales, closings, building the units and that sort of thing. Fundamentally, Fox and Jacobs was involved only in single family. But when I got involved on the operation side, it really educated me in terms of the whole real estate development process. Ultimately, one of my land guys that I worked with and was under me in Fox and Jacobs went to Trammell Crow Company to pursue a career in multifamily development, which ultimately he encouraged me to come over, and I handled the development side as well as the construction side. Make a long story short, that was during the period of time when the RTC debacle was kind of unfolding in Texas. It was difficult to get things done under the Trammell Crow banner. So I figured out and was invited by Bob Gass to join him outside of Trammell Crow. And I started Carleton in 1991 with a mandate for construction, development, and asset management. I have to point out as well that Alfonso Jackson, at that point in time, was the ED at the Fort Worth Housing Authority. And he encouraged me to get involved in affordable housing as well. The very first project I did at Carleton under that banner was Cedar Ridge Apartments, a acquisition rehab in South Dallas, 192 units. And that started my career in the pursuit of affordable housing. The key thing there being, as a minority developer, as with all developers, the key thing is to get equity financing. And the low-income housing tax credits provided the open market opportunity to do that. So That's how I got started in the affordable housing arena today. Carleton still is very much involved in the development of affordable housing. It's a core competency of ours, both as a developer and as a general contractor. So we continue in that vein. It'll always be the base of our business. And as the real estate market gyrates and goes up and down, the affordable part is always there. We will do market rate housing when the market allows that. That pretty much gives how I got involved in affordable housing and how I got involved in Fort Worth. When I was at Fox and Jacobs and went to the operations side, I went over there as president of the Fort Worth division.
Great, great. Well, that is truly an inspiring story. So let's hear from Mary-Margaret. What was your avenue into affordable housing?
Sure. So I am an attorney by trade. That was my day job. And like you mentioned in my bio, I worked for a locally headquartered bank here for a good part of a decade. And when they, all the banks merge, right? I'm sure we're just going to have one bank by the time we all get old, but they merged, and I had a year of doing oil and gas, and I was looking around. I really like to be with a company and have one client, and so I was looking for an in-house position, and Fort Worth Housing Solutions had a job posted, and I did a lot of research because I said, I don't really know much about them. I knew HUD regulations, I knew a lot of banking regulations, but the housing authorities, there's not a whole lot of them across the nation, just 3,400 or so. And so I came on as general counsel. It was the first time they had an in-house attorney. And honestly, what got me to where I am today is probably just asking a lot of questions. I peppered questions to every department head and anybody that would let me sit in their office and learn how a housing authority really works. And so we were in the middle of a huge transformation called RAD, and we were transitioning out of public housing at that time. And I read the notice backwards and forwards, did a lot of highlighting and carried it around like a Bible. And I just tried to learn a lot. And so when the Housing Authority was looking for their next executive director, I was asked to apply, and here I am. But what I love is really it's working for the community that brought me here. I wanted to have a job that was close to the community and close to Fort Worth because I love it so much. And that's what I get to do every day. So I would say it's my love for people that brought me to affordable housing. And what we do every day is we work with private developers like Prentice and others to create more affordable housing. Fort Worth's growing at such a fast clip that we can't keep up, but we build both affordable, and by that I mean subsidized with vouchers and other federal programs, but then also rent restricted using the state tax credits he was talking about. And then also market rate is a portion of our portfolio. So today we have about 7,500 units spread across 40 properties in every single city council district. And I do have to give my thanks to the two men on the call with me because they started this about 20 years ago, redeveloping affordable housing across the city and making sure that it got spread out evenly. So we're just following in their footsteps.
Awesome. That is amazing. So I had to say, Ramon, to be the last one in this conversation, because I know that your path to affordable housing in Fort Worth is rich. So Ramon, tell us a little bit about how you are where you are right now. Where did it all start?
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for having me on the panel. My family and I came to Fort Worth in 1973 to work with the city of Fort Worth. And shortly thereafter, the city of Fort Worth was one of the first cities to receive the Community Development Block Grant back in 1974. Obviously, housing was one of the big part of the CDBG program. And so I was given the responsibility to see how Fort Worth could invest this newly found money in our neighborhoods. And so we began looking at housing in low-income neighborhoods and also partnering with the Fort Worth Housing Authority at the time. I soon became the first housing director for the city and to see how we could preserve and increase the number of affordable houses in the city. At that time, the city was concentrated mostly on single family houses and not in multifamily. And so over the 20 some years that followed, I was very much involved in housing programs. And then really, I really got involved after I retired from the city of Fort Worth in 2001. And I had plans to take it easy and kick my heels up and do a whole lot of nothing. And then Mayor Barr called me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, not a whole lot." And he says, "Well, Fort Worth Housing Authority may could use your help." So they're in the process of trying to transition Ripley Arnold complex, which is a 268 public housing unit in the northwest part of downtown. And they said they could need some help in doing that. I found out that the Board of Commissioners and the staff had taken the bold step of declaring that they were committed to changing the face of public housing. They didn't know exactly how they wanted to do it, but they were prepared to do it. By that time, they had already contracted with Prentice Gary's company, Carleton, to be the developer. And so I stepped in and worked with Prentice, with the board and the staff to look at how the face of public housing in Fort Worth could be changed. I'm not going to get into a lot of details of what's happened. Mary-Margaret can recap a lot of that. But 20 years later, I'm still involved with Fort Worth Housing Solutions. I feel very fortunate in that and have expanded my services to other housing authorities throughout the state and in Arizona also. I think the commitment is that the people that are involved, and I think my other two colleagues on the panel have that commitment to help residents. I always say that's the first responsibility of a housing authority, of elected officials, is the welfare of the residents. Everything else falls in place behind that, how we do it financially, where we construct, but as long as we keep in mind the welfare and the quality of life of our residents, we'll be okay. But in a nutshell, that's where I'm at, and I'm still as enthused and committed to this industry as I was at day one.
Well, that's a big nutshell, Ramon. There's a lot in there. So I just want to ask a follow-up question. You worn many hats in this community, from your time as the director of the Housing and Human Services Department to your time in the city manager's office. So I think you may have touched on this a little bit, but can we get a little more from you, from your perspective? What were the key moments in the evolution of affordable housing in Fort Worth, just from your perspective?
Going back, like I said, when we moved here in 1973, affordable housing, public housing was in the so-called projects, the red brick buildings that everyone would see as they drove by and said, those are the projects, that's public housing. I think shortly thereafter, Fort Worth Housing Authority began to look at maybe there was something more than just providing the projects for those who reside in public housing units. And they began to acquire some units that the federal government had foreclosed on during the housing crisis. And so they began to expand their inventory beyond public housing and have affordable housing, housing that had reduced rent but didn't have the direct subsidy. And so again, I think the mentality in Fort Worth began to change a little bit of what the needs were for low-income families and how to provide for their needs. But I really believe that the big event that I can point to is again referring back to 1999, 2000, when the board and the staff, not as a reaction to a lawsuit, not to a reaction to money being made available, but the commitment of saying, how can we improve the quality of life for our residents? And they began to look at how can we take the assets that we have, convert that into some resources that we can make better housing available for our residents. And they went through a year or so study of how to do it. Different options were considered. And ultimately, they came up with a solution of selling Ripley Arnold. They found a willing buyer in Radio Shack at the time, a very prominent corporate member of Fort Worth that was looking for a new headquarters. And they sold Ripley Arnold for $20 million as is. I believe that decision really began the process that we're into now of really not only expanding, but improving the quality and having this unit scattered throughout the city of Fort Worth, all for the benefit of improving the quality of life for our residents. So to me, if one event I can point to in the last 50 years from Fort Worth is that position that the board took in changing the face of public housing in Fort Worth.
Oh, wow. That's huge. That's huge. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of Ripley Arnold a little bit later. Got a couple of questions for you on that. But, you know, my husband and I have this conversation all the time. He's a former football player in college and professionally. And we have this debate about what makes a great coach. My perspective is when it comes to really great coaching, those coaches that have actually been on the field as a player, there's just something different about them as opposed to somebody who's, you know, watched a lot of film and read a lot of books, right? When you have that firsthand experience. So Prentice, I wanted to ask you, what aspect of your personal experience with affordable housing has informed the way that you engage in developing affordable housing and just your perspective about how it should operate?
Well, it's a process. It was a real learning process for me because starting out, I was a developer, and you get into development to build buildings and to lease them up, and sometimes you sell them, sometimes you maintain them. But that people element that Ramon talked about is one of the key things I had to learn in terms of being effective at producing affordable housing. One of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had is when you build affordable housing, and it's for a family that's coming from a housing platform where it's not decent, it's not safe, makes life very difficult. When indeed you provide that platform of affordable housing for that family, then you've stabilized that portion of their existence where they can build on the other things that they need in order to really participate in the economic mainstream and the social mainstream of society.
Yeah, that's always important. So Mary-Margaret, you mentioned that you had a career in law and banking before taking on the helm at Fort Worth Housing Solution. And I understand that your agency currently serves more than 28,000 people every day. What are the most important changes that your agency has made in recent years? And what can Fort Worth Housing Solutions do to ensure that it continues to expand the supply of affordable housing in Fort Worth and the support that they need to become self-sufficient?
So we've been busy for the last few years. So we've gotten, I've got a lot of things to choose from, but I think the biggest change we've made that's really impacted the city is the conversion of our public housing to other forms of assistance. So I mentioned RAD earlier, that's a HUD term of art there, but rental assistance demonstration. The agency was an early adopter of this tool to reposition our portfolio, much like Ramon described 20 years ago with Ripley Arnold and that whole process. We learned a lot from that, and I think we took everything that we learned and used it as we explored this RAD tool. And so we actually worked with Carleton on some of our very first RAD conversions of properties we owned. And then in 2015, we got a portfolio-wide award to change all of our public housing over to RAD. And Butler was the best example of that, I would say. So Butler is 412 units just east of downtown, completely isolated by highways. Our only neighbor is the now VPA STEM I.M. Terrell Academy that Fort Worth ISD operates. And we put a plan out to our residents to move their units, transfer their assistants to 13 different properties spread across the city, and then gave them all choice. And so what I love about how we did this is every family got to choose what part of Fort Worth was best for them. If they were a senior and wanted to go to a property that was geared towards seniors, that was made available. If they wanted to be close to a school or a church or a job, we placed our new properties all over the map. And then we gave them choice on whether or not they wanted to enter a lottery for each property. And so we successfully relocated all of our families really with little hubbub. And that's a big change from 20 years ago when Ramon describes the Ripley Arnold relocation in Stonegate. That was a challenge, I think, not only for the housing authority, but for the community. And we learned those lessons and we still use them today. We always put our residents first and make sure that they're at the center of every decision we make, because if you do the right thing for residents and the right thing for our employees and our community, it ends up typically being the right thing overall. And so that's kind of the mantra that we lead here or use here at the agency. And I can say we successfully closed 25 RAD transactions between 2012 and 2020. And Butler was officially vacant as of December 31st, 2020. And so that was a turning point for the agency over the last few years.
That's amazing. So this follow-up question to Mary-Margaret's response is really, this actually came out of Fort Worth Housing Solutions 2018 report. And in that report, identified 5 specific issues, fair housing issues: segregation, concentration of poverty, location of publicly supported housing, housing costs, and access to employment. So this is for any of our panelists to answer. How have you directly been involved in addressing any or all of those challenges that are specific to Fort Worth landscape when it comes to affordable housing?
I take a stab at that. I think all of those are very key factors in selecting a new location for public housing, RAD units, affordable housing. And I think early on that was very key in the success of Fort Worth Housing Solutions efforts. And I'm going to point to one decision that Prentice was very much involved with us on this one, and that was the decision to purchase an existing complex. At that time was called Stonegate, and the decision of placing 58 units, public housing units from Ripley Arnold in that location. Stonegate is located next to the 14th fairway of Colonial Country Club golf course. And so obviously it attracted a lot of attention when it became public that the Board of Commissioners was considering purchasing that and placing 58 public housing units there. But we chose that not just blindly, not just because we wanted to be next to Colonial, but because it offered at that time, and I think maybe still is, the kids from that location attended the top rated elementary school in the school district. There was employment opportunities. There was public transportation close by that were retail amenities for grocery shopping. All of those key elements that you just mentioned were located there. Very little poverty, higher, the average income of that neighborhood was higher than the city's average. It checked all the boxes. Politically was a different issue, but the board had the strength to say, this is the right thing to do for our residents and the right thing to do for Fort Worth. And they did it. And I think that set the precedent as we move forward in all of the other 40 plus locations that we're dealing with now.
And my favorite part of that whole story, and what I get to still enjoy today, is we had a neighborhood association that was concerned about us buying that property. And so the housing authority went above and beyond to create a committee that would review on a monthly basis any, issues in management or crime, anything that came up. They had a monthly process. And then I think it went to quarterly, and eventually the group disbanded. But one of our early on concerned citizens came back to the mayor at the time after this had happened, and after he saw that really there was no impact to his neighborhood. It wasn't negatively affected at all. And he said he would be happy to serve on my board. And so he's been, Dick Stinson's been a board member for the last 10 years promoting affordable housing. And it's through that story that we can work with other neighborhoods and communities to educate them on really it's just an unknown. And once they understand that we've been here 80 years, we're going to be here another 80 years. You can come and find us if you have an issue and we'll take care of it. We want to be a good neighbor. I think it takes some of the stigma away from what people might think of as affordable housing. And what Ramon mentioned about putting public housing units in such a great location, that's something that we still, every time we make a decision about where to place something, we want it to be a place that you or I would want to live. It needs to have the amenities, the access that we've all come to expect, because we know that to do better, you have to see better. And so that's part of becoming self-sufficient. And we have programs here, family self-sufficiency programs, home ownership programs, to help support our clients to get, off of the assistance and be able to pay market rate rents because they've gotten the training and education, and give that assistance to the next person in line that needs it. And so when that happens, it's the best feeling in the world. If you come in December, we have a graduation program for those clients, and it's the most inspiring night of my whole year to see the way the system should work. It's a cycle. We know some people will always need it because they're elderly or disabled, but the majority of people want to do better, and we have to show them that that's possible.
And the whole story about Stonegate links back to Ripley Arnold. Ripley Arnold was the fundamental transaction that provided the capital, the cash, so that you could go and do a transaction like Stonegate.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Something that struck me in your conversation was your engagement with the local community, right? The neighborhood and the residents that were around that development in Stonegate and some of the concerns that they raised. So this is something that is probably not unique to Fort Worth, but it happens whenever communities start to have conversations about affordable housing. And typically kind of a common fear or common concern is, that housing, their housing, the cost of their own home and the value of their own home will somehow be impacted. So what would you say to communities here in Fort Worth, but really all over the country who might be listening? How would you respond to that?
Well, we've done the research, and we know that there's studies that you can find that'll show both things happening. Your home appreciating in value if multifamily is built close to it, or depreciating. But we can tell you that over the last 20 years from the Stonegate transaction, that neighborhood has done nothing but appreciate. In fact, the value of Stonegate itself increased 3 times from the time that the Housing Authority purchased it. And so we have 40 examples of how it can work. And I think that you're right, Christina, it's education is like a big key to make sure that people understand. I always, when I chat with people, because a lot of people don't understand who qualifies for affordable housing and what that even means. It seems like kind of if you don't need it, you don't know anything about it almost. And I always ask people, what did you do on your way into work this morning? Did you stop and get a cup of coffee? Did you drop your kids off at daycare? Do you have a lunch appointment? Are you going to go through the Chick-fil-A drive-through? All the people that you rely on to be successful and to make your life easier most likely qualify for the housing that we offer. and they should be able to live in the neighborhoods where they work and where they, where they need to be. They shouldn't have to be on 35 commuting for an hour a day in traffic to get to an hourly wage job that barely pays the bills. And so we want to put affordable housing in the places that make sense, and that's everywhere, because we all need to be everywhere, right? All kinds of housing for all types of people in all parts of town. That's what we say. We don't need to have it segregated in one area or the other, because that's not realistic in today's environment.
The key elements here is management of the property. As Mary-Margaret indicated, we have tracked the impact of neighborhoods where we've gone in, but it goes back to the management to make sure that the property is kept up, that any lease violations by residents are dealt with. One of the things that we constantly heard, well, those people are coming in and they're bringing crime, or they're not going to do this, they're going to do this. But, there's a set of rules, there's a set of criteria to be eligible. And if you can enforce those and make sure that you maintain your property, everyone abides by the rules, there will not be a negative impact on the neighborhood. And that's what Fort Worth Housing Solution is committed to do from the beginning, and continues to do that.
And in the case of Stonegate, whereas the property was in great shape, there were some remediation measures taken immediately after the acquisition that showed the community that, hey, we are concerned about the condition of this property. I believe there was a guard shack for security reasons that we constructed very early in the process, as well as some, minor painting and fix-up. So just to underscore our commitment toward management of this property in a first-class manner.
The other key thing is to having willing partners. And in this case, in the other case, it was a school district. When we were talking about Stonegate and the concern by the residents of the impact that those students were going to have on the elementary school, the superintendent stepped up and said, it is our responsibility to give quality education to every child that shows up at the front door. And the principal was very committed and embraced everyone that came in. And so it was good to have the school district as our strong supporting partner in making this work.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out how some of the key stakeholders stepped up and took positions like that to support the project, because there were certainly the other side that was very evident during the process of getting Stonegate acquired. I do recall that at one of the public meetings had about 400 people, and I was on a panel, I think you were on it, Ramon. Our banker was up there with us. Things got so intense that the police had to escort the banker to her car to get to the airport to go back to Houston after the meeting.
Wow. Anytime we talk about these things where it hits close to home, emotions can run high. But I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper on something that you all mentioned, and that's the partnerships that were necessary for these types of projects to move forward. You mentioned, Ramon, the partnership with the school district. What were some other key partners from the community that really played a part in making sure that Stonegate became a reality?
One of the others was the city of Fort Worth. Although the city was really on the sideline, the Housing Authority is an independent entity from the city, but there's no way they could get out of it. The city council and the mayor took a lot of pressure about this from those who did not want to see it happen. But they stuck to their guns, and they said that they had all the confidence in the world in Fort Worth Housing Authority, its staff, and its commissioner to do the right thing. And I think that was a key element with the school district and the city saying, this has been looked at very carefully. We support it. It is the right thing to do in our community.
And I'm just so thankful that they stuck to their guns and they set that precedence, because today getting things done in Fort Worth is markedly easier than most places that affordable housing is being built. We have such a great relationship, not only with the city council and mayor, but also, as Ramon said, the school district, the nonprofits, all. When we applied for a Choice Neighborhood grant back in 2019, it took the whole city to get it done, but it was $35 million that we could bring in to the city to revitalize areas that have been blighted and overlooked for many years. And I am just so lucky that I had Ms. Holston come before me and set that groundwork, because when I went and made the calls and said, are you guys in, can you help us? It was a resounding yes from everybody. Whether it was, from the mayor's office to, TPW, anybody at the city said, yes, we're in, how can we help? And then the community stepped up, and they stepped up in such a big way that, we won that grant, and we are making real change over in Southeast Fort Worth. And so I don't take it lightly. I want to be a good steward of what was left for me to lead here. And Ramon and Prentice were a big part of that. And really having the strength to stand up and do the right thing, even when it wasn't the popular thing. And I think that's really what Stonegate was.
Yeah. And I'd be remiss if I didn't salute the resolve of the board under Alex Jimenez's leadership at that time. But all of the commissioners had the resolve that this is the right thing to do the right thing and help our residents, which they moved forward under extreme pressure and approved the transaction, and it closed.
Yeah, so
I want to point out one other thing. We talked about neighborhood concern, but there at that elementary school, they had a program called Thursdays Boys. It is a higher income neighborhood, and parents come together and provide activities for boys after class. That group reached out to us and said, we want to know how many kids are coming to this school because we want to make sure they will be part of our program. And so they reached out to make sure they felt included in what was going on at that school.
yeah, so it sounds like from all three of you, partnerships, building collaborative partnerships with some key organizations and individuals in the city is really key to advancing affordable housing here in Fort Worth, but anywhere in the United States. So something else I wanted to quickly kind of touch on, and I think Mary-Margaret brought this up in trying to make sure that people in the community are aware of who qualifies for affordable housing. And there have been some data sets that suggest that police officers, your school teachers, the nurses in our hospital systems and healthcare workers can qualify for this type of housing. And so, Mary-Margaret, would you agree with that? Is there anybody else that most people probably wouldn't necessarily or intuitively consider as being those individuals, those residents, those neighbors that would really benefit from affordable housing across the city?
You hit it right on the head with that. I mean, yes, some teachers, firefighters, a lot of civil service positions, but also if you just walked around downtown, a lot of the service industry qualifies. And we've been very blessed to have such a good partner in Downtown Fort Worth Inc. and their promotion of affordable housing. And so for us, affordable means workforce housing. It doesn't mean people that are not necessarily working, but it means people that maybe haven't reached a point in their career where they can afford a market rate. And so that goes all the way up to 80% of the area median income. And, we have programs as low as 30%, but up to 80%, the near south side in the medical industry. So all those techs and, medical assistants that are working in our hospitals or providing the food in our hospitals, there's a ton of positions. And the near south side of the medical district is the next largest, job center for Fort Worth. And so that's one reason we've expanded and gotten more properties in that area. We know that it's a need. So you'd be surprised if it's not your kid graduating from college and getting their first job that they would qualify, but also maybe it's your mom that's on a fixed income and retired and doesn't have a lot of disposable income for housing. So I think if everybody would sit back and really evaluate how it impacts their lives, whether it's not it's their family members or somebody they know, or just how it affects their daily lives, it's a necessity. It's not a luxury to have affordable housing.
The things that we found out as we were looking at the downtown, which is the largest employment center in Fort Worth, that approximately 60% of the workforce in downtown would qualify for affordable housing. And yet, most of the houses being developed downtown is higher end. And so the folks that can least afford to drive back and forth are the ones that are having to do that.
Wow, that's an amazing statistic. 60% of the workforce in the largest job center in the city can't afford to live there. So that statistic on its own is really a great support for why affordable housing is so important here. So let's get into history. I'm a history undergraduate history major. The United States affordable housing history is complex, and Fort Worth has its own kind of unique history when it comes to affordable housing. And so going all the way back to the 1860s, and we can certainly kind of tie in the racial aspect of affordable housing into this conversation. 1860s in Fort Worth, you had the Trinity River Bottoms and Hell's Half Acre, right, where there were a number of communities of color. And in the 1870s, it turned into Buttermilk Flats and Irish Town and Baptist Hill, and then into Terrell Heights. And in the 1920s, you had the development of Lake Como. And then in the 1930s, the New Deal at the federal level came in, right? And there was a report that came out of Fort Worth that 30,000 of its residents at the time lived in, quote, decrepit and disease-breeding homes. And it was that quote that really brought about the building of Ripley Arnold and Butler Place in 1941. And I think everybody has mentioned both of those housing units in Fort Worth. The fact that Ripley Arnold, according to some Fort Worth historians, was actually built for white residents who needed affordable housing, and Butler Place was built for Black residents. So even then, there was segregation happening in how Fort Worth would deal with providing decent, affordable homes. So based on this history, what are the most important lessons that we can learn from Fort Worth's history on affordable housing? And how do we move collectively forward together?
I take a step at that. I think two things from my perspective to learn. One, segregation does not work. Segregation works against the basic morality of our country. Then concentration of poverty does not work. How can you envision something better for yourself when all you see is poverty around you? So segregation and concentrated poverty do not work. And I believe that's what Fort Worth Housing Authority, Fort Worth Housing Solution has been about and continues to move forward, keeping those two things in mind.
One of the things that comes to mind, I agree with you, Ramon, the concentration of poverty. But in any case, the need for social services to help these folks in public housing or in any circumstance move through public housing and back into the mainstream of society and the economy. And I think in today's world, there are more social services like for public housing authorities are providing to folks than they ever did in the past.
And Christina, I'm a history junkie like you, and if you haven't read The Color of Law, it's a fabulous book on the history of housing in our nation, and sometimes it's very hard for me to stomach where it started. I'm proud to say we've come a long way, but it wasn't just Fort Worth. I mean, that was what the law said back then. And so now when I go on vacation, I make my husband, if I drive by something, I can spot public housing from 500 yards, and I make him detour because it's everywhere, and you can spot exactly what it looked like. Like you said, it was part of the New Deal and the public works. They built a lot of housing really quickly all over the nation, and it's very similar. But today we know that living warehousing our lower income residents is not a way for anybody to live, and we expect better, and so we're doing better. I struggle with it a lot. I found out about a year after joining the housing authority that my great uncle was the architect of Butler, and so I really felt like I had found my place. I found my purpose, and this was a full circle. And we were going to do it better than they did it back then. And so I'm really proud that Butler's going to get a new chapter, because we won't ever have 400 units of affordable subsidized housing in one place again in Fort Worth. I can tell you that it's just not going to happen. So we have to work not only with our public entities, but with our private developers and our partners to make it happen. So we couldn't do it by ourselves, and we do depend on others to make it happen. And that's the great thing about this community, is we really do work well together for a common cause. So I'm excited about the future. Sometimes it seems daunting, but I think that we've got the right group of people to make it happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's really good to hear. It's really good to hear you say that, Mary-Margaret, that I think one of the things we can look forward to in Fort Worth is that we won't repeat that mistake again in kind of concentrating poverty in one area, and then cutting them off with highways literally surrounding the Butler Place housing project was something that we can definitely and have learned from in Fort Worth. So, oh, go ahead.
Well, one other thing that Mary-Margaret mentioned about the general picture of public housing, you can drive by it and identify it in every city of the United States. In today's world, in substantially all of the work that Fort Worth Housing Authority has done, and we as a developer take pains in making sure that public housing, you can't identify it by a curbside drive-by, that it looks like all the other housing in that neighborhood. And in many cases, the architecture is much better than what existed there before that complex was built.
Prentice, that's one of my favorite things, is when I'm in the car with my husband and we drive by an apartment complex in Fort Worth, he says, "Is that one of yours?" And I say, "Absolutely not. We wouldn't own that." Mm-hmm. Because our stuff typically looks better. Mm-hmm. Then I would put our new projects and what we've developed over the last 20 years up against, a market rate development. Mm-hmm. If you could see the standards at River District or Knights of Pythias or Hillsides, all of these great developments that people have no idea are affordable. And that's our goal. We want it to be someplace you or I would live, and no one knows the difference.
So that's a great goal to have. Everybody from here on out, we need to make sure that Mary-Margaret can never identify, nor can her husband identify a publicly funded or supported project, affordable housing project in Fort Worth, but really anywhere in the country, right? And so we're closing in on the end of our time, and I want to make sure that I get this final question in and give each one of you an opportunity to answer. So the national news is full of reports of additional federal funding that could help increase the supply of affordable housing. What should happen over the next few years in terms of funding and financing to help ensure that more individuals and families can find safe, affordable homes?
I mean, we always need more funding. Like I said earlier, our community is about 1 million people, and the Housing Authority has a budget for our voucher program of 5,400. So 5,400 vouchers for, our community is just not enough. So funding will make a huge difference. But also, we need to build more. It can't just be vouchers. It has to also be actual hard units. And so we're actually evaluating some new things that have come out from HUD and the federal government in just the last few weeks on ways we can continue to expand our portfolio, but we have to make sure they're sustainable. Public housing is being repositioned now because it wasn't a sustainable model, and we don't want to make that mistake again. So partnering with private entities and making sure that in 20 years, those properties are still kept up and are still in a condition that we would find acceptable is super important. And that comes from, how you set up a deal, right, Prentice?
Yes, absolutely.
I think also we need to make sure that we don't forget lessons learned from the past. It's good to get more money, but how you use the money is the key. And so I'm confident in Fort Worth that the lessons will not be lost, will not be forgotten. I'm even more confident because of the young leadership like Mary-Margaret at the agency and her commitment that she has made that we're in good hands. We need more resources, but we got to do it right. We got to remember that segregation, that concentration do not work. You got to have good partners in the community, and you got to be in every segment of our community to be successful.
Yeah, Prentice, you're a finance guy. So what kinds of things can we start to do or continue doing that would make sure that this is sustainable?
Okay. At the end of the day, the cost of a new development for an affordable complex is pretty much the same as it would be for a market rate complex. So you're going to need a subsidy to make it work. If you go all the way back to the Tax Reform Act of 1986, where the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program came into being, that market has developed into one of the most efficient markets for financing housing, the equity portion, that there's ever been, and it works very, very well. The problem today is the demand for affordable housing is so intense against those subsidies that you look like in the state of Texas, the competition to get tax credits for the purpose of building an affordable housing complex is like a 10-to-1 kind of ratio. 1 in 10 can get funded. The market is very, very efficient, and also the delivery systems to get things done quickly, the infrastructure is in place. All they really need to do is to increase the amount of money being allocated to the tax credit program, and you'd see an immediate impact on the new production of affordable housing. And I think instead of really working toward more or different programs and that sort of thing, at least the ones that impact the capital structure, I think the Housing Authority and you can talk about the things that affect the revenue line, the voucher and so on and so forth, but to get it built, things that impact the capital structure, all they have to do is increase the allocation of money that goes through the tax credit program. I advocate that very strongly.
You make it sound so simple, Prentice.
It almost is that simple. I mean, instead of getting $1.25 per resident, if you got 150, 175, 200, and the market could absorb it just like that.
Wow. Okay, from your mouth to God's ear. Let's hope some decision makers are listening to our conversation. Well, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise on this very important topic here in Fort Worth, the evolution of affordable housing. Again, my name is Christina Brooks. I'm your Chief Equity Officer here with the City of Fort Worth. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gio to close us out.
Well, I'll keep this really
Thank you,
short and
Christina.
simple. Yeah, thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Such a fascinating conversation. And come check out the show at the Fort Worth Community Arts Center. It's the Evolution of Affordable Housing exhibit. Thank you all so much again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.